I had been erased from my family for 10 years. They told me I was nothing not worthy of their name, and they cut me out of every memory, as if I had never existed. But on Christmas Eve in Dallas, I walked back into their ballroom uninvited on paper, but undeniable in flesh, carrying proof of every lie they had told. By the time the night ended, their pearls, their legacy, and their perfect image would shatter in front of hundreds, and the world would watch it unfold. The December air in Dallas felt sharp enough to cut straight through the fabric of my dress as I stepped out of the cab. Strings of white lights draped across the Whitmore estate shimmered against the dark sky, the kind of display that announced money and pride before anyone even walked inside. I pulled my coat tighter, steadied my breath, and reminded myself that 3 years had passed since the divorce papers were signed. Tonight was the first time in a decade I was walking back into this house, not as someone erased, but as someone ready to be seen. The oak doors opened into a foyer drenched in warmth and the scent of pine. Guests in sequined gowns and crisp tuxedos clustered around champagne flutes, their voices echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling. The invitation I had received had not even carried my name. It had simply read, "Christmas Gala of the Whitmores," an elegant way of pretending I was not part of them. The omission was deliberate. I stepped further inside, and the ripple began. Eyes flicked in my direction, whispers spread like a swarm. Who is that? Did she really come back? My mother Eleanor stood near the Christmas tree in a silver gown, her pearls glowing in the soft light. She turned her head slightly, as if she had heard the chatter, but instead of greeting me, she adjusted a glass ornament. My father Charles shifted beside her hands, sinking into his pockets, jaw set. His glance cut toward me once before sliding away. I forced my smile to stay steady. "Good evening," I said. Eleanor's lips curved without warmth. "We weren't expecting you." Her words landed like ice, soft enough to sound polite, but sharp enough to leave a mark. I walked past them without answering. From across the room, a familiar voice called my name. Clara. Lucas Reed, a college friend and now a journalist, broke from a group of distant relatives and clasped my hand firmly. His voice lowered so only I could hear. "Long time. Glad you made it back." I met his eyes, letting the calm of his presence ground me for a moment. It was the first genuine welcome I had received all night. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and garlands, every corner screaming perfection. I moved through it slowly, the floor polished enough to mirror the hesitation in my steps. Then I saw her. Beatrice, my younger sister, radiant in red satin, at the base of the staircase, her arm looped through David's. My breath tightened in my chest. David, once my husband, now leaning too close to the sister who had always been handed everything. His hand brushed hers in a gesture too intimate to dismiss. Beatrice caught my gaze. A small smile curved her mouth, not of joy, but of triumph, as if daring me to react. She turned back to him without a word. More whispers surged louder now, buzzing like bees against my ears. Didn't she leave for good? Isn't that the ex-wife? I held my head high and walked forward, ignoring the stares that followed. Lucas watched from across the room, his expression alert, as if he already knew tonight would not stay buried in pleasantries. I drew a slow breath, the strings of a quartet rising in the corner, and let the music carry me deeper into the party. But beneath the calm of my steps, I knew this night would not end the way my family expected. A young woman in black stepped forward holding a clipboard and gestured for me to follow. She led me through the crowded ballroom past tables draped in silk and crystal, then down a narrow corridor toward the edge of the catering area. When she stopped, she pointed to a small round table tucked near the swinging kitchen doors. A single chair, no centerpiece, no place card beyond my name, scribbled hastily. The clatter of trays and the smell of garlic butter drifted from the kitchen. "Here you are," she said, her tone rehearsed but indifferent. I lowered myself into the chair, feeling the scrape of metal legs against the floor. Across the room, laughter rose like music, the sound of belonging, while I sat in the corner, as if I had stumbled in uninvited. A group of children occupied the table just behind me, their squeals and giggles loud enough to draw glances. I could feel eyes on my back, judging amused. A cousin I barely remembered passed by carrying a drink and leaned close enough for me to hear. "Lucky we even let you in." He smirked and kept walking. My jaw tightened, but I did not respond. I folded the napkin across my lap and sipped water from the only glass set before me. From the head of the room, I heard Beatrice's voice, bright and confident, spilling into the air. She stood surrounded by a circle of relatives, her hand resting lightly on David's arm. She tossed her hair back, the light catching on her satin dress and the necklace at her throat. I froze. The delicate string of pearls, small but unmistakable, had belonged to our grandmother. I remembered the day she promised it would come to me, her hand resting on mine, the words written later in her will. Now it glittered against Beatrice's collarbone, as if it had never been mine at all. Beatrice's laughter carried across the room. "Soon all of this will be ours," she said to the relatives gathered around. "The house, the shares, the vineyard property. Mother already promised." I sat still, my hand tightening around the stem of my glass. David did not speak, but his silence was heavy. He nodded slightly at her words, his expression one of quiet satisfaction, as though the humiliation unfolding across the room had his approval. His gaze swept once in my direction, then away, dismissing me without effort. The chatter grew louder, the clink of glasses sharper, and I felt the walls closing in. For a moment I wondered if anyone remembered what fairness looked like. I wondered if anyone cared that the necklace had been meant for me, that inheritance was not a prize to be stolen, but a promise to be honored. The children behind me burst into laughter again, their voices mingling with the clang of the kitchen doors. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to sit upright, to appear untouched. I had learned long ago that sometimes the strongest answer was silence, not because it meant surrender, but because it gave me space to plan. I let my eyes linger on the pearls one last time, their pale sheen a reminder of every slight and every dismissal. I told myself that if Beatrice believed she could parade them tonight without consequence, she had underestimated me badly. As the music swelled and the guests began moving toward the dance floor, I kept my hands folded neatly on the table, my face calm. But inside something shifted, sharp and unyielding. Tonight they thought they had placed me in the shadows again. They did not yet realize the shadows were exactly where I gathered my strength, and soon the light would turn toward me. I could not pull my eyes from the pearls resting against Beatrice's collarbone. Memory slipped in before I could stop it. A warm afternoon in 2014, when my grandmother sat in her garden and pressed that necklace into my hands. She had written my name into her will, signed in front of witnesses, her voice steady, as she said it would always belong to me. That moment had lived quietly in the back of my mind all these years, a promise I thought was untouchable. After she passed, I had asked my mother about the necklace. Eleanor waved it off, saying the clasp was broken and the pearls were no longer worth keeping. She told me it had been misplaced, perhaps lost in storage, nothing to dwell on. I believed her then, because I wanted to. Standing in that ballroom now, watching the very same necklace sparkle on my sister's skin, I felt the lie wrap around me like a net. The string quartet struck up another carol, and guests rose from their tables, moving toward the center of the floor. I slipped quietly from my seat, weaving past servers, balancing trays, and ducked into a side hallway lined with coats and gift bags. The noise dulled here, replaced by the faint hum of voices. My bag felt heavy at my side as I reached for the zipper and pulled out my laptop. I pressed the power button, the glow of the screen illuminating the dim corridor. For weeks before this night, I had scrolled through old files late at night, documents my grandmother had left with her attorney, scanned copies that I kept out of habit more than intention. I had brought them with me to Texas, almost without thinking, like carrying a shield I wasn't sure I would need. Now I opened the folder, my heart steady, and there it was. The original will dated June 2014, declaring the pearls to be mine. My finger hovered over another file beneath it. This one was dated 2019, 5 years later after my divorce and after I had been cut out of the family gatherings. It was labeled Addendum. I clicked, and the page appeared signed by Eleanor herself, granting temporary use of the necklace to Beatrice. No mention of return, No expiration, only vague wording that gave her everything she wanted. The signature was neat, the seal pressed clean. My stomach knotted. I leaned against the wall, the weight of it sinking in. They had not only lied to me, they had rewritten what was never theirs to alter. My grandmother's intention had been erased with the stroke of a pen hidden beneath polite smiles and polished appearances. Footsteps echoed down the hall, and I snapped the laptop shut, sliding it back into my bag. A server passed by carrying an empty tray and nodded politely, unaware of the storm gathering in my chest. I forced myself to return to the ballroom, my face smooth, my steps measured. Beatrice twirled on the dance floor, the pearls catching light as she laughed, her hand brushing David's arm. Around her, the family clapped, raising glasses in celebration. I stood at the edge unseen, and for the first time in years, I did not feel small. I felt ready. My fingers brushed the outline of the laptop inside my bag. Proof was no longer a memory. It was something solid, something that could not be dismissed. I watched my mother's satisfied smile as she watched Beatrice, certain of her victory. And I knew the night was far from over. The music swelled the air, thick with champagne and pretense. I let myself breathe slowly, letting the anger settle into focus. The necklace was more than an heirloom now. It was a key, and with it, I could open every door they had tried to lock. I kept my gaze on the pearls, my mind already moving to what would come next. They thought I was cornered. They had no idea what I was holding. The photographer called everyone together near the grand staircase for the family portrait. Guests shuffled into place, adjusting jackets and smoothing dresses, the air buzzing with the shuffle of shoes and forced laughter. I stood nearby waiting for my name, but none came. Names were called in quick succession, each cousin, each aunt, even distant relatives I barely remembered. My mother directed the arrangement with a stiff smile, placing Beatrice at the center, David close by her side, her hand raised proudly to rest against his arm. When the photographer lifted his hand and said, "Ready?" I realized no one had even glanced my way. I took a step forward, then stopped. A thin velvet rope had been placed at the edge of the group to keep the crowd back, and I was standing behind it. The photographer snapped the photo, the flash bursting white across their faces. I was not in the picture. I never had been. As the crowd dispersed, I glanced at the table settings near the head of the room. Polished name cards in golden script rested against crystal glasses. I searched the rows, scanning each elegant place card until I reached the end of the line, where no card sat waiting. A server passed by with a tray of wine, and I asked if perhaps there had been a mistake. She gave me a practiced smile and said the list was complete. For a moment, the noise of the party dulled into a low hum. I felt the ache of being edited out, not with cruelty or shouting, but with precision, as if my absence was the most natural thing in the world. I steadied myself, pushing the sting deep inside, and returned to my seat by the kitchen doors. It was then I caught the sound of hushed voices from a group of younger cousins huddled by the dessert table, their phones glowing in their hands. One leaned toward another, whispering with a mix of disbelief and excitement. "Isn't this that Reddit pro-revenge story trending?" I froze. The others laughed nervously, scrolling quickly before tucking their phones away. The details were too close to be coincidence. They were talking about me, though none of them realized the woman in the story stood a few feet away watching them. Heat crept up my neck, not from shame, but from the strange realization that my words, once typed alone in the dark of my apartment, had spread far beyond this family. Strangers knew my story. They had sided with me without even knowing my name. The thought steadied me like a quiet army standing behind my shoulders. I moved back toward the main floor where Beatrice stood near the bar, surrounded by admirers. David laughed too loudly at something she said, eager to play the role she had cast for him. As I passed, I caught sight of her phone resting on the counter, the screen lighting up with an incoming message. The name at the top made my breath still. Cole. The letters burned against the glow, a name I recognized from years before, a man Beatrice had crossed paths with long before David. My eyes narrowed as I watched her snatch the phone, quickly tilting the screen away before slipping it into her purse. Her smile flickered just slightly before she returned to her audience. I stood rooted for a beat, my mind racing. The pearls. the will, the whispers of inheritance, and now coal. Threads were beginning to weave together, and the picture they painted was darker than the holiday lights suggested. The music swelled again, glasses clinked in celebration, and Beatrice lifted her hand high, the pearls shimmering against her throat. I knew this night was only beginning and the next move would not be hers. Lucas found me near the edge of the dance floor where the crowd had thinned. He slipped a folded newspaper from the inside of his jacket and pressed it into my hand without a word. I opened it carefully, the newsprint brushing against my fingertips, and my eyes caught the headline. CNN Business, April 2023. Nonprofit founder expands medical outreach across Texas. Beneath it was my photograph taken outside the clinic I had built from nothing, a caption naming me as the founder and director. For a moment I let the page rest open between us, the words shining under the light of the chandelier. Lucas's voice was low, almost drowned out by the music. "Proof," he said. "They can pretend not to know you, but the world already does." I folded the paper and tucked it into my bag beside the laptop. My heart beat evenly, not with pride, but with the quiet knowledge that I was no longer a ghost. At the far table, a group of younger guests huddled together, the blue glow of their phones lighting their faces. One of them read aloud, his voice cracking with excitement. "It has over 3 million upvotes. Listen to this comment. If this is true, her family sounds toxic and she deserves better." His friends laughed nervously, stealing glances around the room. Another added that the story had been reposted to our Best Off and even mentioned on a podcast. They had no idea I stood only a few feet away, listening as strangers online defended me more fiercely than my own blood ever had. I said nothing. I did not need to. Their voices carried far enough for others to hear, and a ripple of unease passed through the older relatives clustered near the bar. I could feel the weight of their shifting stares. I moved back toward the service hallway away from the noise and opened my bag again. The laptop screen glowed softly as I pulled up folders one by one. Scans of the 2014 will, the addendum from 2019 bank records, and the article Lucas had just handed me. Each file slid into place like pieces of a puzzle I had been building in secret. My fingers brushed over a small flash drive, clipped inside the bag, one I had carried for months out of habit. Tonight, it finally had a purpose. The music swelled behind me, laughter and clinking glasses filling the gaps between carols. I closed the laptop and slipped it away, adjusting my posture before returning to the crowd. My expression was calm, my smile controlled. Across the room, Beatrice twirled again, the pearls catching every beam of light. David's laugh followed hers, loud and hollow, as if rehearsed. I saw Eleanor beam with pride, while Charles raised a glass in silent approval. To everyone else, it looked like the perfect picture of family. To me, it was a house built on lies. Lucas caught my eye from across the room, his nod almost imperceptible. The time for silence was slipping away. I kept my hands folded neatly, my breath steady, and waited. They thought the evening belonged to them. They did not notice the storm gathering just beyond the edges of their celebration, ready to break when the moment was right. My father raised his glass and cleared his throat, the chatter in the ballroom dimming to a hush. He stood tall, his suit pressed sharp, the look of a man who loved order and appearances. Tonight, he seemed proud, his voice steady, as he congratulated Beatrice for her poise and David for his dedication. He spoke of legacy, of Whitmore traditions, of the future that rested on their shoulders. Not once did he glance in my direction. It was as if I were not even in the room. The crowd responded with polite applause, glasses lifted high, and Beatrice basked in the glow. My mother Eleanor clutched her pearls with a smile that did not reach her eyes, satisfied that her chosen daughter stood at the center. I sat still at my table by the kitchen doors, letting the noise wash over me. Then slowly I rose. My chair scraped against the floor, and the sound cut through the room. Dozens of eyes turned as I straightened my dress and stepped forward. I kept my tone light, almost pleasant, but each word edged with steel. "I only wonder, Father, if legacy is built on honesty or convenience." The pause that followed was heavy. My father's jaw clenched. He lowered his glass but did not respond. Eleanor broke the silence with a laugh, too sharp her voice ringing across the tables. "This is not the time for drama, Clara. Sit down and let your sister enjoy her evening." I smiled back at her, calm and unshaken. My hand slipped into my bag, fingers brushing against the folder I had prepared. "Drama was never my intention," I said softly. "Truth, however, always finds its way to the surface." I pulled out a folded document, its edges worn from handling, and laid it flat on the nearest table. The seal of the county court shone faintly under the light. A murmur rippled through the guests as I smoothed the page and lifted it high enough for those nearby to see. "This is the original will from 2014, signed by my grandmother, leaving the pearl necklace to me." The sound in the ballroom shifted, whispers rushing like wind through tall grass. Heads turned, voices rose. Beatrice stiffened her hand, flying to her throat, as if to shield the pearls resting there. David's laughter died on his lips. Eleanor's face drained of color. She stepped forward quickly, her smile frozen. "Documents can be so easily misunderstood," she said, her tone brittle. "The family knows what she wanted." I tilted my head and let the silence stretch. I could feel the weight of the crowd pressing in, their curiosity sharpening. My father's gaze flicked from the paper to me, then back again, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The proof in my hand spoke louder than anything I could say. Around us, the music faltered as the quartet's bow slipped. The moment stretched taut, every eye locked on me. I folded the will carefully and slid it back into my bag, the rustle of paper loud in the silence. I smiled again, steady, unflinching. If legacy is built on lies, then tonight we will see how strong it truly is. The whispers swelled into a low roar, guests leaning toward one another, questions spilling. Beatrice clutched David's arm, her face pale under the glittering lights. Eleanor pressed her lips thin, trying to regain control, but the room was already slipping away from her. I stood alone, yet felt taller than I had in years. The will was only the beginning, and they had no idea what else I carried with me. The murmur of voices thickened around me, but I did not flinch. I reached into my bag and drew out a small black flash drive, the kind that looked insignificant until you knew what it contained. My fingers were steady as I crossed to the projector set up for the evening's slideshow. The screen behind the dance floor flickered, the soft images of garlands and holiday greetings dissolving into the glow of my files. Gasps rippled through the room. Eleanor's hand shot out as if she could stop me, but Lucas stepped forward and spoke firmly. "This is legitimate," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. "I am here to confirm it." I glanced at him briefly, grateful, then turned back to the crowd. The first document filled the screen, the county seal shining under the glare of the projector. June 2014. The original will. The pearls designated to me. The signature of my grandmother, crisp and clear. I heard the swell of whispers, guests leaning closer, their disbelief tangible. The next slide appeared. An addendum dated 2019, Eleanor's signature at the bottom, the words "temporary use for Beatrice" typed neatly above. A rustle of shock moved through the crowd. Beatrice's face drained as her hand rose unconsciously to her throat. She whispered something to David, her eyes darting, her body stiff. I let the silence stretch before clicking again. Images of the necklace appeared, close-up photographs from an appraisal taken months before. Receipts confirming its location, proof that it had been stored under my mother's control, but never rightfully transferred. I did not speak. I let the evidence speak for me. Eleanor's voice cracked as she tried to laugh it off. "Old paperwork can be misread," she said weakly. "These things are complicated." Lucas cut in again, clear and calm. "I have reviewed every file. There is no misreading. The will is binding, and the addendum was never valid." The room stirred louder now, guests pulling out phones, whispers becoming recordings. I could see younger cousins raising cameras, live streaming to whoever might be watching. The family image was unraveling in real time. Then came the final slide. A screenshot of messages. Beatrice's name at the top, the words exchanged with Cole lined below. I heard a sharp intake of breath. The texts were casual at first, then intimate, impossible to mistake. Beatrice's hand clutched the pearls tighter, her eyes wide. A voice rose from the back. It was Cole himself, stepping into the light. His suit was neat, his expression grim. He spoke with no hesitation. "It is true. I was with her while she was with David." The room erupted, gasps and cries spilling out as relatives covered their mouths, others turning to stare at Beatrice. David's face turned stone, his body rigid as the truth settled over him. He pulled his arm from Beatrice's grasp, his jaw locked tight. She tried to speak, but no words came, her lips trembling. I stood still, the glow of the projector washing over me. My heart did not race. It was calm, as though I had been walking toward this moment for years. Around me, the image of a perfect family shattered piece by piece. Guests whispered openly now, no longer hushed. Aunts shook their heads, cousins exchanged shocked looks, and strangers recorded every second. Lucas's voice rang again, steady and final. "Every fact has been confirmed independently. What you are seeing is the truth." The music had stopped entirely. The quartet sat frozen bows in midair. The air was heavy, each breath sharp with tension. I closed the file and the screen went black, leaving the crowd staring at their own reflections in the void. The silence after was louder than any accusation. My mother's face was pale. My father's expression cracked in a way I had never seen before. Beatrice swayed slightly where she stood, pearls trembling against her skin. David stared at her as if she were a stranger. I stepped back, folding my arms loosely. The evidence had been laid bare. The party would never return to its polished surface. And yet I knew the night had one final turn waiting. Jasper was the first to move. His chair scraped back hard against the floor, and the sound silenced the last of the whispers. He had been sitting near the front, a longtime family friend, and lately Beatrice's most visible companion. He rose slowly, his eyes locked on her trembling figure, and for a moment I thought he might steady her. Instead, he slipped the gold ring from his finger and set it down on the linen tablecloth with deliberate care. The clink of metal was louder than any shout. Without a word, he turned, walked across the ballroom, and disappeared through the double doors. Beatrice's hand fluttered toward him, but froze halfway. The pearls shook against her throat, her face pale beneath the glow of the chandeliers. David stood stiff beside her, his jaw clenched, his eyes flat and cold. He said nothing, only stepped back as if distance could shield him from the collapse. My mother Eleanor pressed both hands to her pearls, her composure unraveling. She looked around as if someone might save her, but every pair of eyes in the room was turned in judgment. My father Charles tried to speak, his voice cracking, as he muttered about misunderstanding, about documents taken out of context. No one listened. The guests were already on their phones, recording, whispering, streaming live. The Whitmore name, once polished and proud, was unraveling in front of the very people they had worked so hard to impress. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The silence of the room did the work for me. I stood tall, my arms loose at my sides, my breath steady. For the first time in years, I felt weightless. Lucas stepped closer, and his hand brushed mine, steady and warm. I let him take it, our fingers entwining as we turned toward the exit. No one stopped us. Guests parted in silence, their eyes following, but their voices hushed. I could hear Beatrice sobbing behind me, the sound raw and desperate, but I did not turn back. The night air outside hit my face sharp and cool. The music inside had stopped, entirely replaced by the muffled chaos of voices and the low thrum of disbelief. Cameras still flashed through the windows, reporters already typing furiously. By the time we reached the street, the first headlines had begun to appear. Local journalists snapped photographs, voices called questions, and I walked past them, calm, unhurried. In the days that followed, the story spread beyond Dallas. Online forums dissected every detail, from the will to the necklace to the affair. The posts that had once lived quietly on Reddit surged back to the top. Commenters called it justice, served others called it a Christmas reckoning. One trending headline read, "She shook them at Christmas." For the first time, my voice was not drowned out. It was amplified. I watched the news clips replaying the footage, the grainy live streams from cousins who had thought they were sneaking a laugh, The world had seen the truth with their own eyes. There was no undoing it. Eleanor and Charles retreated from the public, their pride in ruins. Beatrice vanished from social media, the pearls nowhere to be seen. David slipped quietly out of the picture, his silence louder than any defense. I did not gloat. I did not throw their shame in their faces. I only carried myself with the same steady calm I had held inside that ballroom. Justice had not needed to shout. It had simply needed to be shown. When I think back to that night, I remember the heat of the lights, the weight of silence, and the sound of Jasper's ring against the table. It was the moment their world cracked open, and it was the moment I finally walked free. When justice arrives, it does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through signed papers and silent truths until it fills a room so completely that no one can ignore it. Tell me, if you had been in my place, what would you have done?